Hi, welcome. It's me, Amy, the MA mentor. We're here today for another installment into the Anatomy and Physiology series. Today we're going to talk about the respiratory system. So let's go ahead and get going with that. All right, the respiratory system. This will be part one. There will be two parts. So please make sure that you watch both parts for sure. It'll be very helpful. All right. If you have not already, as always, please like and subscribe to the channel. Subscribing is free and it really does help me out and allows me to make more of these videos for you. So let's go ahead and get moving. Um, as far as introduction goes, the respiratory system's function is basically just to move air in and out of the lungs. Okay. Now it's not quite as simple as that because there's reasons for this that we'll get into. But this movement includes what we call inspiration and expiration, or inhalation, exhalation, same difference. Um, there is ventilation, respiration, breathing. All of those terms basically mean movement of the air in and out of the lungs. What the other functions are, the other reason all of this happens is also to exchange gases, primarily oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then to transport those gases throughout the body. All right, part one of this particular system is going to be basically just looking at the pieces and the parts, right? Because that's kind of what anatomy and physiology is, right? Anatomy is the pieces and the parts of the system, the various organs, the plumbing, so to speak, of that system. And then the physiology is all about how it works, okay? So here we have the basic diagram of the respiratory system. And it starts, of course, with the upper respiratory tract, which is basically just everything kind of from the neck up. So it's the nose, the pharynx or the throat, and then the part of the larynx. Okay. The lower respiratory tract then starts at the trachea, goes down into the bronchi and the bronchial tree here, and then also the lungs. So you'll often hear, especially when they talk about infection, infection being of the upper respiratory tract or the lower respiratory tract. It's just basically referring to what part of the respiratory system is being affected. We have also the nasal cavity and the paranasal sinuses. For those of you who have sinus issues, you're probably very familiar with these. So just to kind of as a rundown here, here is the nasal, as they call the nares or the nostrils. Okay, that's where air is taken in. Okay. And then the vestibule, of course, is the inside of the nose, basically. You have the conchi, and these are just divided into inferior, middle, and I'm sorry, superior, middle, and inferior. You have the sphenoid sinus here, the frontal sinus here, and then just to um, make clear where everything is, here's where your oral cavity is, your mouth. Okay. And then, of course, the soft palate and the hard palate that divide the oral cavity and the nasal cavity from one another. Here is how our pharynx, or the throat, is divided. The area where the nasal cavity connects with the throat is called the nasopharynx. Makes sense, right? Nasal and pharynx, nasal and throat. Where the oral cavity or the mouth connects with the throat is called the oropharynx. Oro meaning oral or mouth. And then in this particular diagram, where the throat kind of splits off into the trachea and the esophagus. They're terming the hypopharynx, and it is called the hypopharynx because it's the lowest part. However, you will also see that termed as the laryngopharynx because it's where the larynx and the pharynx kind of meet up. Right here, you have this little flap called the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is there primarily so that when you drink something, so intake liquids or intake food, solids, the epiglottis will kind of flap down over the trachea to keep those liquids or solids from entering the trachea and therefore going into the lungs, because the trachea is your windpipe and that leads into the lungs. And we don't want liquids or solids going into the lungs. They don't belong there. They should be going down the esophagus to the stomach, which the esophagus is right here. And that is why that little flap is there, to keep that from happening and to kind of help direct the food and liquid where it needs to go. Now, I know everybody's done it. You'll go to drink something, or if you're like me, you swallow your own spit and do it. But you'll go to drink something or something, and it will go down the wrong tube, as we have always said. Basically, what's happening there is the epiglottis has just failed to do its job, and some of that, or it happened too quickly, and the epiglottis didn't have time, and some of that will try to go down into the trachea, and that's what causes you to cough and gag and all of that. All right. Oh, and then these, I'm sorry, are your vocal folds right here, which is also where your larynx is. Okay, so let's take a look at all of this area where the trachea and the epiglottis and all of that resides. This is the front and this is the back, so the anterior view and the posterior view. So the anterior view, here's your hyoid bone, and this would be up in just under the chin, like right up at the top here. The thyroid cartilage is what actually creates the Adam's apple. Women do have these. However, when we hit puberty, estrogen that we exude, secrete more of at puberty, does not have the same effect on that area as does testosterone for males. Also on the larynx itself. So that area altogether kind of becomes more prominent in a male than it does in a female. I've seen plenty of females that you can kind of see it, and it's usually because they're very thin. But for the most part, you'll see the thyroid cartilage or the Adam's apple sticking out a little more prominent on males. You also have the cricoid cartilage, which is just underneath there. And you can actually feel that if you go right about here and you press, it almost feels like you're about to choke. That's your cricoid cartilage. Beyond that then is your trachea. And if you notice, and even if you feel, because this is in the front of your neck, right? You can feel the cartilage. You can feel kind of like the rigid, stiff, they're like rings, okay? That's there primarily to keep that trachea open and from collapsing. If those rings of cartilage, which that's what it is, it's cartilage, weren't there, your windpipe could very well collapse on itself, and that would make it very difficult to move air. However, if we look at the posterior view here, you'll notice the rings don't go all the way around the trachea. They're almost like C-shaped rings. And here's why. What sits directly behind the trachea is the esophagus. And if the rings continued all the way around the trachea, it would be difficult when we were swallowing food or liquid for the esophagus to expand enough to allow some of those things to go down. So leaving that little bit of space in the back kind of allows for the soft part of the trachea and the esophagus to kind of be able to, for lack of a better term, squish into each other. Okay. And it makes swallowing food and liquid a lot easier while still maintaining structure for the trachea. All right, this is the kind of, if you were looking down the throat, this is where the larynx is, or what they term in this particular drawing, the vocal folds. Okay, right here. There's some cartilage here. The trachea is beyond that. Here's your epiglottis. And then the opening is actually called the glottis. Now, how sound is made and what's happening right now, if you could look at this part of my body, because I am speaking, these are vibrating. And they're kind of vibrating together, which is causing, and as my air is being pushed through them, that's what's causing the sound to come out of my mouth. The thicker these are, the deeper of a voice you have. So that's why males tend to have deeper voices than females. I know I have kind of a deep voice for a female, so mine might be a little thicker. But again, that has to do with testosterone. And testosterone in males, when it's released at puberty, really affects that part of the body more so than it does females. And that's why you'll hear young boys that are going through puberty with their voice will kind of crack every now and again. It's because those folds are beginning to thicken, and then eventually they will have deeper voices. Okay, here is the remainder of the system. So kind of the big part, if you want to call it that. So here's your trachea that we were just looking at. And as the trachea goes down, it gets to a point at which it splits. Okay. It splits off into bronchi or bronchus. Okay. Bronchus is, of course, singular, bronchi is plural. But it splits off into two, the right and the left. So this would be the right, this would be the left. And enters the lungs at that point. Now notice the lungs are different. People always seem to think, and if they were to draw them, they'd probably try to draw them mirror image of one another, but the right and left lung are very different actually. On the right side, you actually have three different lobes. So 1, 2, 3 lobes, the superior lobe, the middle lobe, and the inferior lobe. On the left side, you only have two lobes. You only have a superior and an inferior. And then you have this little notch right here called the cardiac notch. That has to be there. And this lung is a little slimmer because it has to make room for the heart, because right here is where the heart lies. Okay. The right lung is a little fatter, a little wider, and a little shorter. Okay. And that all just has to do with the anatomy. It has to do with the fact that the heart, you have another organ right here, a very important organ. And since it lives right here, there has to be an area for that. Okay. Then you have the layers of the lungs. So on the outside, you have the what's called parietal or pleura. On the inside, you have visceral pleura. And then in between, there's a pleural cavity. Okay. Visceral pleura is primarily the part that is right up against the lung, while the parietal is on the outside of the cavity. There is some fluid, very little, but fluid in between to allow for the lungs to expand and contract without putting too much friction on it. Like we see in other parts. The heart has got kind of the same setup. Okay, so that is the lungs, the bronchial tree. We'll keep going with this, but that's kind of your big part of your respiratory system. Now this is an alveoli. Let me go back just a moment. The alveoli are on the very ends of this bronchial tree, and it is called a bronchial tree because it looks like a tree. It looks more like roots of a tree, but if you flipped it upside down, it kind of looks like branches of a tree. So where the alveoli exist are at the very end of this bronchial tree here, and they look like this. It is what is also known as the terminal bronchiole, because the bronchiole is the smallest part. It goes bronchus, bronchial, bronchiole, okay? And where these alveoli are, or alveolus, singular, are at the very end, and they are surrounded by a vein and an artery. Pulmonary, because they're part of the lungs, okay? So you have the pulmonary artery, pulmonary vein. They're all surrounded because this is where gas exchange happens. And remember how I told you that deoxygenated blood comes in as blue, oxygenated blood comes in as red. In this particular instance, it's not coming in so much as it's going out that way. And because these are very small, if you watched the cardiovascular video, you know these are capillaries. And one of the main features of capillaries is that a capillary is a blood vessel that will allow for substances to move across it. So that's why it makes perfect sense for these to be at the alveoli so that gas exchange can happen. Okay. And in part 2 of this video, we'll talk more about how gas exchange actually occurs. But for right now, this is the area in which that happens. All right, let's just talk about breathing real quick. And then, like I said, in part 2, we'll go more into the physiology part of the lungs. So for breathing, there are pressures that are involved, okay? Atmospheric pressure, which is the pressure from outside, okay, from outside the body. Intrapulmonary pressure, which is the pressure inside the lungs. And then interpleural pressure, which is the pressure that's inside that pleural cavity, okay? When we breathe in, when we inspire or inhale, just before that happens, when the lungs are at rest, the atmospheric pressure, the outside pressure, and the intrapulmonary pressure are equal. So there's nothing happening, okay? When we inhale, the atmospheric pressure is then greater than the intrapulmonary pressure, and it forces the air into our lungs, basically. Okay, changing those pressures. And what also happens is our diaphragm, which is a huge muscle that lies just under the lungs at the bottom of the thoracic cavity, flattens. Because normally the diaphragm is kind of a domed shaped muscle. It flattens out when we breathe in to allow our lungs to expand more. Okay. When we exhale, then the pressures switch, where then the interpulmonary pressure has now become greater than the atmospheric pressure. So that forces the air out of the lungs. And the diaphragm then relaxes and returns back to its dome shape to not only return to its shape, but also to kind of give a little oomph to the lungs to push the air out. Okay. So in her inhalation, interpulmonary pressure is less than atmospheric. It allows the air to rush in. The diaphragm flattens. On exhalation, the pressures switch and the interpulmonary pressure now becomes greater than the atmospheric pressure, allowing the air to be forced out of the lungs or exhaled, and the diaphragm then returns back to its dome shape in a state of relaxation. All right, so that is the anatomy section of the respiratory system. I really do look forward to seeing you in part 2. And again, if you haven't already, please click that like and subscribe button. It really helps me out, and I really do appreciate it. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time.